In this video, I'll give you a detailed breakdown of every single boss in Nerub-ar Palace on normal and heroic difficulties. A lot of work has gone into this video, so if you guys could like and subscribe, that'd be greatly appreciated, but let's crack on with the first boss. Ulgrax the Devourer is mainly a single target boss encounter, and you'll want to bloodlust at the start of this fight. During the first phase, the boss will cast Brutal Crush on the tank with aggro. This ability deals massive physical damage and leaves a tenderized debuff that reduces incoming healing, so make sure to taunt swap after each cast. Ulgrax will spawn Stalker's webbing all over the arena. Dodge the swirlies and webs or you will be rooted for 8 seconds and suffer heavy nature damage. These webs that are left behind can be removed with digestive acid, a debuff that Ulgrax places on random players that deals ticking damage to them for 6 seconds. Once the acid explodes, it will deal heavy nature damage to anybody within 7 yards, so make sure that you're spread. But it will also dissolve any Stalker's webbing that it strikes, so make sure to hit as many as possible. Ulgrax will also cast Brutal Lashings on a player. This player will be marked with a swirly that everyone in the raid must stand in, as the damage is split between everyone inside. The marked player must make sure to place the swirly away from the boss, as directly after the lashing he will pull everybody towards him. The strength of this pull is reduced by the amount of players that soaked, so everybody must make sure to be inside. If you get pulled too close to the boss, you will die, so make sure to keep running away here. This would be a great place to use a Warlock Gateway. Upon reaching 0 energy, Ulgrax will cast Hulking Crash at the center of the room, dealing damage to the whole raid and knocking everybody back, so make sure that you're not near the edge or any webs for this. After this leap, the boss will start to Juggernaut charge across the room, which you must dodge. While dodging, your tank needs to pick up the adds while the raid nukes them down. These adds will apply a bleed to the tank, so tanks should be prepared here. Once the Ravenous spawns die, they will then drop a chunky Viscera that players will need to pick up and take to the boss once he returns. And once you reach the boss, simply use your extra action button to feed the boss and remove a stack of his ready to feed debuff, reducing Ulgrax's damage taken by up to 99% dependent on his stacks. During phase 2, he will repeatedly cast Hungering Bellows, which increases in damage for each cast, so make sure you feed him quickly to return to phase 1, and then you can repeat until he dies. The Bloodbound Horror is a primarily single target encounter with some bursty priority add phases, and you'll want to bloodlust on pull for this fight. Before you start this fight, you'll want to assign your raid into 2 different groups with equal tanks, healers, and DPS, and these groups should play on opposite sides of the encounter. This is because the boss will target the tank with a gruesome Disgorge frontal. Everybody hit by this frontal will take upfront damage, but more importantly, they will be sent to the Shadow Realm. The active tank must make sure that they are positioned near the void zones ready for this frontal, so that when the raid is struck, you can instantly attack the adds. Inside this Shadow Realm, the tank must pick up aggro on the Lost Watcher, while the other tank taunts the boss. These Lost Watchers will cast Black Bulwark, which must be kicked or it will grant the Bloodbound Horror a big absorb shield. Forgotten Harbingers will spam cast Manifest Horror. These casts will spawn small adds that travel towards the boss. Do not let these adds reach the boss or your raid will suffer big AoE damage, so use crowd control to slow these adds down while everybody nukes them. Upon killing all of the adds, Group 1 will return upstairs and then Group 2 will repeat the exact same process. You have to swap groups here, as after being struck by the frontal, you will receive a debuff that increases the damage you take from future frontals. On Heroic, shortly after the frontal, the Horror will spawn beams that rotate anti-clockwise. These beams can become a huge problem if spawned poorly, as they will cut off the Shadow Realm group from the adds. Luckily, tanks can manipulate the spawn of these beams as they always fire out from each of the Horror's sides, so tanks make sure to spawn one of the beams just to the right of the downstairs group, as this will give them much more time. Outside of this, the boss will randomly debuff players with Grasp from Beyond, which will cause the player to drop puddles underneath them every second, so make sure not to place these under other people and just stutter step as you drop them. The boss will cast Crimson Rain, which will apply a huge heal absorb to the whole raid which healers must heal through. And finally, at full energy, the Bloodbound Horror will cast a massive AoE nuke in Gore Splatter. All players must run out to the edge of the encounter to dodge this, otherwise it will likely one-shot you. Sikran is a completely single target fight where you will want to bloodlust on pull. Throughout the fight, Sikran will target 4 players with phase blades and dash to them in an order. Each player will leave behind a simulacrum or clone, and on Heroic, if anybody is struck, they will also leave a clone behind where they were struck. The marked players will want to move away from the rest of the raid towards the edge of the encounter, while staying spread from other marked targets. Forming a rectangle will make this much more reliable. After Phase Blades has been cast, Sikran will then cast Decimate on 3 players, which fires a damaging line through the marked players. These players will want to line up these Decimate lines to hit the clones left behind from Phase Blades earlier, as this will cause them to explode. dealing upfront AoE damage and leaving a dot for every detonation. It will also leave a pool on the ground that you'll need to avoid. You want to purposely detonate these clones in this controlled manner, because once the boss reaches 100 energy, it will cast Shattering Sweep. This will detonate all remaining clones and deal bonus damage, so if you have too many active, it will likely be a wipe. During this sweep, you must also make sure to run out from under the boss, as it deals less damage the further away you are, and if you're struck, you'll receive a damage taken increase debuff. Frequently throughout the fight, the boss will quickly cast a rain of arrows. You'll simply need to dodge these swirlies whenever they come in. Finally, Sikran will also cast a tank combo which starts with 2 exposes, dealing upfront damage and then immediately follows with a phase lunge. Just after the 2 exposes, the other tank will have to taunt to make sure that he takes the third part of the combo. Rasha'nan is a predominantly single target encounter with some smaller adds that you'll need to burst down. You'll want to Bloodlust on pull for this fight. Rasha'nan will target multiple players with spinneret strands, which these players must take out to the sides of the arena. These strands will drop a puddle of webs and tether the targeted player to the center. While tethered, the player will suffer ticking damage while standing inside the puddle, so the player must break the tether by running away from it. And on heroic, any other players hit by the web will also be tethered. Once the tether is broken, the raid will then suffer AoE damage, so ideally it's only the targeted players that need to break the tether. Rasha'nan will also spawn rolling acid on 2 players. After a few seconds, acid waves will travel in the indicated direction from the player, so make sure that you aim these waves away so that you don't send them through your raid. Otherwise, the whole raid will be struck and suffer heavy nature damage. These waves, however, do also incinerate the spinneret's webs, so the targeted players must try and make sure to clear as many webs as possible with this mechanic. Do be wary though, as this will leave an acid pool behind. The boss will periodically channel an erosive spray, dealing heavy damage to the whole raid for 4 seconds. This will also apply a stacking lingering erosion, which leaves a nasty 12-second dot, so healers must be prepared for this ability. The boss will also periodically mark players with an infested spawn. After a few seconds, this mark will detonate, dealing big damage to anybody inside the circle, so make sure to stay spread, but it will then also spawn adds that need to be cleaved down ASAP. If targeted by this ability, get as close as you can to melee without overlapping, so that the adds die quickly before they kill you. Upon reaching 100 energy, the boss will fly away to a random location, and during this time she will cast Caustic Hail, spawning swirlies that the whole raid needs to dodge as they chase her to a new location. Upon reaching the new location, she will begin to cast Acidic Eruption, which needs to be interrupted. A successful cast will grant the boss immunity for 9 seconds, and any following cast will deal increased damage. Once Acidic Eruption has been interrupted, the boss will immediately cast Web Reave in front of her. You will need at least 4 people to soak and split the damage here, as failing to do so will pull the soaking players straight off of the edge. Tanks will need to use defensives for the boss's Savage Assault. Any unmitigated damage will be left as a damage over time, and you must taunt swap after each assault. Broodtwister Ovi'nax is a single target boss with a heavy focus on adds throughout the encounter. You'll want to Bloodlust on pull for this fight. The boss arena is separated into 3 sections, all containing different eggs that will hatch different adds throughout the fight. All of these adds that will spawn must be nuked down by your raid. They are the biggest priority while they are active. Upon reaching 100 energy, the boss will activate the closest container with Ingest Black Blood. This channel deals ticking damage while applying a healing absorb to the raid and spawning swirlies that you'll need to dodge. Healers need to be prepared for this cast. Once the channel finishes, Sanguine Overflow will start to slowly expand across the arena from the container, and if this overflow touches an egg, it will empower and hatch the corresponding add, as well as applying a nasty raid-wide dot that will probably wipe you. The big eggs will spawn colossal spiders that must be picked up by the tank. Each time they vicious bite, they'll gain a 25% damage increase, and if these eggs are triggered by the overflow, they become necrotic, gaining 50% increased health, and they'll also leave a necrotic wound from their vicious bite, reducing the tank's healing taken. The medium eggs will spawn voracious worms. These worms are stationary and will spam cast Poison Burst, which must be kicked at all costs. If these eggs are empowered by the overflow, they will become ravenous, again increasing their health by 50%, but also increasing their cast speed by 100%, meaning more people are going to need to kick this mob. The smallest eggs will spawn 4 blood parasites that will fixate random players. If these parasites reach their target, they will cast Infest, applying a damage over time effect, but more notably summoning 2 more parasites that will fixate 2 new people. Make sure to kite these parasites and use crowd control on them to make sure that they don't reach you. If these eggs are empowered, the parasites become accelerated, again gaining 50% increased health, but also gaining a stacking movement speed increase. To stop these eggs from hatching from the Sanguine Overflow, we need to use Ovi'nax's experimental dosage debuff to hatch them ourselves. This debuff will be applied to 2 players or 4 on Heroic, and once the debuff expires after 6 seconds, it will deal area of effect damage to anybody in the circle, as well as applying a healing absorb. Players marked with this debuff should make sure to hatch different eggs, prioritizing the ones closest to the sanguine overflow. This can be difficult as it's not very forgiving if you end up going to the wrong egg, so try and pre-assign eggs with world markers, pings, or even weak auras. Tanks will have to deal with Ovi'nax's volatile concoction, inflicting high nature damage and leaving an 8-second nature dot. Once this debuff expires, the tank will suffer nature damage based on their missing health, so make sure that the tank is healthy. To make sure of this, tanks should taunt swap on every debuff application. Finally, on Heroic, Ovi'nax will apply a sticky web to random players, dealing damage and reducing their movement speed by 70%. These targeted players should move away from the raid, while the rest of the raid gets away from them, because after healers dispel this slow, it will apply a root to anybody stood inside the swirly, as well as damaging them. Nexus-Princess Ky'veza is a purely single target fight where you'll want to bloodlust on pull. If any player falls below 10% health during this fight, they will instantly be one-shot by the boss's Reaper mechanic. In the first phase, Ky'veza will mark random players with an assassination debuff. Once it expires after 6 seconds, it will deal massive shadow damage to anybody within the circle, and also apply Queensbane, a damage over time effect that on Heroic, once expired, will fire out hard-hitting orbs in 3 directions from the player, so these players should make sure to take these debuffs away from the group to not hit anyone. Ky'veza's assassination will also leave behind a Nether Phantom at each location, and these clones will mimic Ky'veza when she casts Nether Rift. Ky'veza will spawn her rift on the active tank, and the clones will spawn theirs at their location. These rifts will pull all players to their location, killing anybody that enters. The idea here is players marked by the assassination should spread out in a formation so that the clones will spawn and cancel out each of the other pull-ins, so you get pulled to the middle point between them all. During this time, it's likely that Queensbane orbs will fire out too, so be prepared to dodge these at the same time. These clones will also pick a random player and charge them with Twilight Massacre. After 6 seconds, the clone will charge through the targeted player, inflicting heavy shadow damage and applying Queensbane to anybody in its path. Positioning is very important for this mechanic, because wherever the clone ends up will be the new spawn point for that Nether Rift. Marked players will want to aim these charges out from the group, but keep them spread out so that you don't get overwhelmed by the next pull-in when the boss casts Nether Rift. Occasionally, the boss and all clones will cast Nexus daggers, firing out 3 daggers, so make sure to avoid these lines. Tanks will have to deal with the boss's Void Shredder mechanic. This deals heavy upfront damage and leaves behind a Chasmal Gash, dealing shadow damage over time, and increasing the damage taken from future Void Shredders, so just make sure to tank swap after each one. At 100 energy, Ky'veza will then teleport to the middle of the room and begin to cast Starless Night. Once she begins her channel, she will pulse raid-wide damage that your healers will need to keep on top of. During this phase, Ky'veza will continuously spawn 2 eclipses that rotate clockwise opposite from each other. These eclipses will mark parts of the room that explode after a few seconds. You must stay outside of these marked zones. While dodging these eclipse zones, random players will be targeted with a Regicide, attaching a set line to the player that will again explode after a few seconds. Ideally with this line, you'd move up and down your line to not move it too much, but sometimes this isn't achievable, so keep movement to a minimum so that you don't overlap them and kill other players. Once Ky'veza's energy is fully depleted, she will return to phase 1. But this time, she will spawn an extra Nether Phantom from Assassination. And then on her 3rd Starless Night, it will become an Eternal Night that lasts forever, pulsing increasing damage until she wipes your raid. The Silken Court is a 2-target fight with a shared health pool, and you'll want to bloodlust on pool for the start of this fight. Before you start this fight, you'll need 2 pairs of players to pair up, ready for the web bomb mechanic. These web bombs are periodically thrown on the ground and need to be triggered by the pre-assigned pairs that will need to enter the middle of the web bomb at the same time so that they can create a binding web to each other. This will show a large circle on your screen indicating the distance you can be from each other before the bind snaps. The reason you need to bind to each other is for Nerub-ar's Reckless Charge. The boss will burrow and mark a charge across the arena, and the webbed pair should stand on either side of this charge to extend their web across its path to stop the boss from charging into the wall and wiping the raid. On Heroic, you'll need 2 pairs to stop the boss. After stopping Nerub-ar, he will take 100% increased damage for 7 seconds. Outside of this, Nerub-ar will face a random direction and cast an Impaling Eruption Frontal, dealing massive damage to anybody caught in it, and stunning them with an Impaling Spike until the raid kills the spike. Make sure to dodge this, but if people do get caught, hard swap and focus down the spikes. He will also occasionally cast Call of the Swarm, summoning multiple Shattered Shell Scarabs that will fixate players, kill and CC these scarabs, or they gain increased movement speed and immunity to crowd control. Finally, he will cast Piercing Strike on the active tank, dealing big upfront physical damage and debuffing the tank to take 100% increased damage from future strikes for 35 seconds. Taunt swap after 1 stack here. Skynspinner will repeatedly spam cast Poison Bolt on the tank, and she is generally a stationary boss outside of her Skittering Leap, where she will leap to a random location to continue spamming her attacks. Sikaj will also apply Venomous Rain to multiple targets throughout the encounter. This deals high upfront damage and leaves a 20-second nature dot on anybody stood within the circle, so make sure to stay spread out for this. Once Sikaj reaches 100 energy in the first phase, she will then teleport to the middle and begin the first intermission. Here, Ansurek will burrow and won't be active. Sikaj will begin channeling Shatter Existence, granting her a huge absorb shield that players must burn through while dodging the entropic barrages she is constantly firing out. Simply sidestep these web cones by standing near one that's about to explode, then you can proceed to stand in that area. Getting struck by these cones will deal heavy shadow damage, leave an 18-second dot, knock you back, and increase the damage you take from further barrages, so you must try and avoid this. Once the shield is broken, we'll enter stage 2. In this phase, Sikaj will lose Venomous Rain but will gain a few abilities. She will use Web Vortex on the whole raid, which will pull everybody into her, binding everybody together through binding webs, while she quickly follows with an Entropic Desolation. All players must make sure to move out of this circle ASAP or you'll die. Then after, all linked players will also need to run away from each other to break the binding web to reduce incoming damage. She will also face a random direction and cast Strands of Reality. Simply dodge this frontal cone or you'll suffer heavy damage. Sikaj's old Poison Bolt is replaced with Void Bolt, basically behaving the same, but this time dealing shadow damage. And then once Sikaj reaches 100 energy, she will Void Step to the middle and begin casting Cataclysmic Entropy. If this cast is successful, it's a wipe, so we need to utilize the other boss. In this same phase, Ansurek will lose Reckless Charge, but will gain Stinging Swarm. This places a debuff on 3 players that deals ticking damage to them and increases the damage they take by 50% until they are dispelled. Once this debuff is dispelled, it will jump to the nearest player or Sikaj. You'll want all debuff players to be stacked under Sikaj during her Cataclysmic Entropy cast, while the rest of the raid moves away so that the healers can dispel the debuffs one by one onto Sikaj. Upon transferring all 3 debuffs to Sikaj, she will be debuffed with Stinging Delirium, disorienting her for 5 seconds and increasing her damage taken by 100% for the duration. Once Ansurek reaches 100 energy in this phase, we will then begin the second intermission. During this intermission, Ansurek will teleport to the middle of the room, while Sikaj disappears. Upon reaching the middle, Ansurek will gain a huge absorb shield that you need to burn through while dodging his Spike Storm. These rings will expand after exploding, taking up a big portion of the room, so make sure to focus on dodging here. Getting struck will deal massive damage and stun you with an erupting spike until your raid kills the spike. Upon breaking the boss's absorb shield, we've reached the final phase. This phase is arguably the hardest as all abilities are active except Call of the Swarm and Web Bomb. The loss of Web Bomb is important because now Sikaj's Web Vortex is much more important, as at least 2 pairs must keep their binding webs from breaking to stop Ansurek's Reckless Charge. Ansurek also gains Unleash Swarm, channeling a heavy ticking raid-wide dot that increases in damage over time. Healers, make sure you're prepared to heal this up. Outside of that, make sure to position well again to dispel the Stinging Swarm debuff onto Sikaj, and then you just burn the bosses until they're dead. While there is one final boss in the raid, Queen Ansurek, we haven't been able to test this fight on the beta, so I'll be making a separate detailed guide just for the last boss. But that's it for Nerub-ar Palace, so if this guide did help you, then please feel free to drop a like down below and subscribe to your boy, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.